to the worship service of Grace United Church in Wellsville, New York. This week across the country, we celebrate mothers. Here at church and in many churches, we celebrate the contribution actually of all women who selflessly give of themselves to share God's love not only with their own and other children, but who serve in so many capacities in the church and in the community. There are so many exemplary women in our midst. Now, you're probably aware that there are halls of fame for exemplary participants in all sorts of endeavors. I grew up near the Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio. And of course, there's a baseball and a basketball Hall of Fame, a hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto, and there's even a radio Hall of Fame. But I wonder if you're aware that there is a Sewers Hall of Fame. The Sewing Hall of Fame is the creation of the American Sewing Guild. It was launched in the late 1970s, when sewing education had been dropped from many schools, and because more women were working outside the home and they had less time to teach the sewing arts to their children. The ASG aimed to keep alive the interest and tradition of sewing. Now I wonder, did you also know that there's a Hall of Fame for people who love to quilt? Are you sitting on pins and needles thinking about a summer trip? Well, I'll tell you where it is. It's in Marion, Indiana. It's not far from Indianapolis. It's in the house of Marie Doherty Webster, who literally wrote the book on quilting. Her book, Quilts, Their Story, and How to Make Them, became the first book published on quilting in the United States. It was so very popular that it was printed and reprinted over one century and into the next. You may or may not know that we have several sewers and quilters who are involved in our church. This week, some of them sent me some pictures of their handiwork. Now, from the looks of what I've already seen, some of their works could make it into the Hall of Fame. They all have fascinating stories about how they became interested in their craft and what it means to them. Nancy Johnson told about how both of her grandmothers had done a lot of sewing. One was a seamstress, and she made all of Nancy's dresses when she was a small girl. Her other grandmother quilted her whole life, and Nancy has two of her quilts, including the Dutch girl quilt that her grandmother had made one for each of her grandchildren. She said that she had always enjoyed sewing, so for her, quilting just came naturally. She finds quilting and sewing very relaxing. Anna Wiley has been sewing since she was a young teenager. She was sewing clothes for her sister and mom by the time she was 15. She has kept at it, and she's quite adept, even jumping back into it just weeks after a major surgery on her elbow. She came to town less than a year ago, and she's a newcomer to the Wellsville area, but it didn't take her long to open up her own sewing shop on the main street of downtown. It's called Anna's Attic. Unlike the first two, Sue Johnson decided to dabble in quilting because she enjoyed crafting. She said, "I always loved to do crafts, so one day I decided I would teach myself to quilt, and I fell in love with it." And fall in love she did. She said she loves the whole process, from picking the design and what fabric would look good together, then to sewing the pieces together, and then doing the final steps until the whole project is complete. Sherry Herdman had an aha moment when she attended her first quilt show. She was impressed, she said, by the way the quilter's artistry looked like painting with fabrics. And so she began her journey, taking classes and developing her own style. Lois Griffith from Columbus, Indiana, joins our worshiping community weekly through our online worship services. A Houghton graduate, she visited us last year and gave me a quilt that hangs in my office. Her interest in quilting was sparked when she and her husband, a pastor, were given a quilt by the ladies of a church when they were leaving to go to another church. She had always sewn for her family, so in time, when she met a master quilter, she found in her a mentor who helped her learn how to quilt. Like the others, she says that she loves thinking and praying for the person for whom the quilt is being made, even as she works on it. She says that she loves the color, the pattern, the geometry, the texture. She loves the people that she's met and even the mathematics involved in planning a quilt. She's had some quilts accepted in competitive shows, and recently she just completed a teapot quilt for her granddaughter because, well, you might guess, they love to drink tea together. Well, if it were up to me, I would enter all of these artists' masterpieces into the Quilters Hall of Fame. Wouldn't you? Their pieces involve so much thought, planning, and hours of hard work. Kudos to them, and kudos to others who I may have inadvertently missed. Please send me your pictures. These artists come from a long line of sewers and quilters. Now, the Quilters Hall of Fame is a 21st century creation, but if it had been around in the 1st century AD, a likely inductee would have been a woman from Joppa whose name meant gazelle. This could have been because when she was born, her mother thought that she would be graceful and swift. She certainly lived up to her name, pronounced Dorcas in Greek or Tabitha in Aramaic. She was a kind person who deftly impacted others' lives for the good. Dorcas should be the patron saint of all sewers and quilters. The story about her in Acts chapter 9 is prefaced by another story. Peter was not far from her town of Joppa. He was traveling, visiting believers in the town of Lydda, and God worked a miracle through him. The text begins, "There he found a man named Aeneas, who was paralyzed, and he had been bedridden for 8 years. 'Aeneas,' Peter said to him, 'Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and roll up your mat.' Immediately Aeneas got up, and all those who lived in Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to God." The account then turns to Dorcas. In Joppa there was a disciple named Dorcas. She was always doing good and helping the poor. About that time she became sick and died, and her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room. Lydda was near Joppa, so when the disciples heard that Peter was in Lydda, they sent 2 men to him and urged him, "Please come at once." After she became ill and died, members of her community sent for the Apostle Peter to do what he could. Peter went with them, and when he arrived, he was taken upstairs to the room. All of the widows stood around him, crying and showing him the robes and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. All the widows were these needy women, because back then most females in that age were those folks that were not attached to a man. They had little access to the wealth of the patriarchal society. These women showed him tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made. This comment didn't mean that they merely showed Peter examples of the fine needlework that Dorcas had done for herself. The words used in Scripture indicate the widows were actually wearing the clothes made for them by Dorcas. There was great meaning in the process of giving and in receiving. The same is true today. Sue Johnson commented that for her, the meaningful part of quilting is how others react to what she has created, how they see the beauty, how it is reflected in their faces, she says. In turn, Sherry Herdman told of how moving it was for her when a person was brought to tears by seeing a cherished keepsake incorporated into a quilted piece that she had created. The widows of Joppa no doubt called Peter's attention to these garments as examples of Dorcas's kindness and generosity. She was, in fact, a follower of Jesus. The text calls her a disciple, the only woman in the New Testament so called, and she was devoted to good works and acts of charity. These facts about Dorcas are probably why, when she died, the community sent 2 men to Peter to ask him to come. Dorcas was such a contributor to the community that they wondered how they could possibly get along without her, and they had to try something. Now I wonder, did Dorcas's neighbors think that Peter could restore her to life? Besides the reports that they had received about Peter and his miraculous deed, their decision to contact him was perhaps bolstered by their recollection of several legendary stories. If the prophets Elijah and Elisha each could revive a child, and Jesus himself was able to bring the widow's son at Nain and Jairus' daughter back to life, not to mention Lazarus, it's not unreasonable to believe that Peter, who had healed Aeneas, might just be able to perform a similar feat. We do know that Peter had a reputation as a miracle worker, and he'd been able to restore health to Aeneas, this man who'd been bedridden for 8 years. So maybe they clung to this glimmer of hope. And as it turns out, Peter does, through the power of God, resuscitate Dorcas and return her to the community that cherished her. But what we want to focus on today is not so much the raising of Dorcas, but rather to focus on her good works and the connection to her sewing skill. Whenever it was that Dorcas became a follower of Jesus, she didn't have to start wondering what God might call her to do as a disciple. She already knew how to sew, and she probably even enjoyed it. What she must have realized is that whether or not Jesus might eventually call her to undertake something new and unexpected, there was no shortage of ministry. No shortage of ministry opportunities right there in her community, right then. Opportunities in the form of widows in need. Our friend Lois Griffith had a similar story. She said that when she was a new quilter, she commented to a wise woman that maybe she should be doing something more useful for others. You see, she said, volunteerism in her community was highly praised and recognized. She remembered they were sitting on the woman's porch, and the woman gently turned to Lois and said, "Lois, what is that in your hand?" Biblically adept, Lois, she recognized the question. This was the question that God had asked Moses. "What is in your hand?" "Well," she said, "I was wearing my ever-present thimble and holding a needle." Like Dorcas, she tried to make her quilting mean as much to others as herself through teaching and through giving quilts. Dorcas used her resources and her skills to help others. We're not told whether or not she had a husband or whether she was ever married, but apparently, unlike many women in that day, she had some means of support. Her skill, coupled with her income, positioned her to address the needs of these women who, because they were no longer attached to men, had no means to purchase materials to make clothing for themselves or for their children. And of course, contact with those women led Dorcas to see some of their other needs as well. So she was moved to other acts of charity, probably in the form of food and health care, childcare, and perhaps even a listening ear. Such kindnesses would not have gone unnoticed, even among the men of Joppa. And her example no doubt inspired others to be good builders, or good teachers, or good caregivers, and so on. Sherry Herdman told of how once a customer paid it forward. She asked him, rather than to pay her in dollars for a quilt that she had made and he had requested, that he could pay her with a kindness to another person. To her amazement, that customer installed skirting and insulation around the trailer home of an elderly couple. When a quilt is gifted, a piece of the quilter's heart is in that piece, and that gift can change lives. Later, when she was planning to move to the Dominican Republic, she became involved with an organization called Mariposa. It's a foundation that helps girls in that country. It educates, empowers, and employs. Sherry was tasked with starting a sewing program for the girls, and so she gathered donated sewing machines from our area, and she set up a program that has taught hundreds of girls and young women to sew. This skill provided them an invaluable source of income. But she notes, sewing is not only a way to help provide for a family, it is also an art form and a gift that nourishes not only the soul of the sewer, but also the person receiving the piece of their work. It's true. In both the giving and in the receiving, there's a blessing. And so, not unsurprisingly, in our Acts story, when Dorcas died, apparently unexpectedly, the whole community felt her death deeply. This is where the story of Dorcas connects for each of us. Jesus may call some few of us to some field of mission for which we have to learn new skills, but more often, we suspect his call is to put the skills and interests that we're already aware of and perhaps are even passionate about at Jesus' disposal so that we can be channels of God's love right where we are right now. What is in your hand? This is one of the exciting things to consider as we look forward to doing asset mapping at Grace United on June 18th. We won't be dreaming up new visions of things our church could do, things that may be well beyond our abilities or interests. Rather, we'll reflect on the things that we are doing. What gives us joy? What strengths do we already have? How do we spend our time? And how might these things serve a greater purpose? Although there is no way to determine whether Dorcas's physical features reflected her given name, Gazelle, her devotion to good works and to acts of charity certainly points to someone who was willing and prepared to serve the needs of others with dispatch. She was probably not unlike Nancy Johnson's grandmother, who diligently sewed even as she aged and arthritis got the best of her. Nancy remembered that although often her grandmother was bedridden and had bad arthritis, especially in her hands, she kept quilting. Nancy said she always wondered how she could hang on to that needle with those hands. Sewing is the craft of fastening or attaching material using stitches made with a needle and thread. We've heard stories from the women in our midst, how they have built connections, sometimes through the love and crafting the thoughtfulness as grandmothers created for granddaughters, and in turn modern grandmothers created and gave to their granddaughters. Sometimes as quilters mentored younger women, others who gifted acquaintances and strangers, others who taught classrooms of girls, and each of whom prays for those who will receive their handiwork. They build and continue to build community. Dorcas attached fabric with stitching, but in doing her work, in exercising her gift, she managed to stitch together a community. Our gifts can do that, because in using them in God's service, we bind ourselves to others and they to us, and we are brought closer together. Paul wrote about the body, the church, being knit together in love. But Dorcas shows that the act of stitching itself can be a means of love. Amen.